Many of you probably already know Jen as a teacher at Spiritus Sanctus, or the widow of the late Nick Thomm, or as a friend or prayer partner, or as the mother of Sarah, David, and Andrew. I'm not going to present her resume because the credentials she's bringing to this talk today aren't things she obtained in educational institutions. You know, earlier generations used to say you don't get a sheepskin in the school of experience, you get your hide tanned. Jen's qualifications to speak to us today are really from the school of hard knocks. I first became familiar with Jen when I met Nick, her husband. He was looking for a job as a reporter, and at the time I was running a Catholic newspaper called Credo, and we needed a reporter who wasn't afraid to drill down on a story or confront authorities or others who might be stonewalling. It turns out Nick had actually been doing that in a newspaper in Steubenville. He and Jen were recent graduates of the Franciscan University of Steubenville. They just moved to Michigan. Jen was already teaching science, I think, at a private independent Catholic school in Clarkston. They were young marrieds compared to me and Sally at the time. So I asked questions about how his wife might deal with the demands on a reporter's life. The hours might be erratic, deadlines were certain and unforgiving. And I explained also that working in a Catholic newspaper was like seeing the church with his pants down. Is she going to be offended when you bring back stories of some unsavory things that go on? Well, he took the bait and he made a point of describing their life together, including Jen's tenacity, her fidelity to the faith, and her love of family, willingness to fight the good fight. Nick was proud of her and proud of their marriage. He believed that their marriage had apostolic purpose. They didn't just have a marriage, they shared a mission. So from Nick's first description of his life together with Jen, I was impressed. I'm going to leave out details, of course, that would step on Jen's story, but I think I can say, when first facing the truly shocking and disturbing news of Nick's brain tumor and its prognosis, they didn't shy away from seeing their lives as public witnesses. Whatever the future brought their way, they would receive as having first passed through the heart of God. And they were disciples. They were called to live their lives as witnesses of God's love. What's the future going to bring? We've just learned about this tumor. Are we going to get a miracle? Are we going to get a nasty prognosis? We're going to get new breakthroughs in the neurosciences and new treatments. Is there going to be imminent death or slow decline or long-term healing? Nobody knew. But that challenge was not just going to be a private family affair. They were going to live it out as witnesses to God's governance in the affairs of men. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew who held the future. And their motto would become, Jesus, I trust in you. Nick and I were close, personally and professionally. We worked very closely together for 12 years, and we spoke candidly with one another about our lives, our relationships, our culture. He remained very much in love with Jen. That hadn't cooled. She was Nick's brown-eyed girl, which I was reminded each time his phone rang and I heard Van Morrison's tune. Romance brought them together, but their trust in Jesus and commitment to practical holiness and service kept them together. They were not just a married couple, but a missionary couple. So please, welcome a woman, a sister in Christ, and a witness to the resources Christ offers us to embrace rather than escape adversity. Jen Thomm.
So many of you probably know Nick's voice. He was Al's executive producer for 12 years, would have stayed longer if he was able. But he's most well known for closing off his newscast every day with the most fascinating fact. I did not prepare one today, but maybe I can come up with one by the end. Nick and I first met at Franciscan University, and it was actually orientation weekend. We were in line for the registrar's office to register for classes. and we had a mutual friend, and she introduced us. We became fast friends, best friends. There was always more there for him. Took me a little while longer, but didn't take too long. We started dating November of freshman year, dated all through college, and married shortly after graduation. We knew within about a month that we were meant to be married, but not finishing was not an option for either one of us. So we were intentional about forming relationships. I never once said no to guys' night. He never once said no to girls' night. We knew how important those relationships would be. Very quickly after getting married, we moved to Michigan, a state that neither one of us had ever visited, but we both wanted to live here. I don't know what our ideal was, but here we are. He grew up in Illinois, and I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania. We met in Ohio. We were faced with the challenge of infertility immediately, and it wasn't expected, of course. We were probably one of the first couples in our circles to get married, and it seemed to be happening for everyone else, but it wasn't happening for us. And that was a 5-year roller coaster of emotions every month, up and down. Some of the darkest days we faced. And so in that, before we even had children, I came to the realization that this was a 3-person deal, right? And God was the major player here. And that any children that we would welcome would not actually be mine. They belong to Him. They're just simply entrusted to us. And so with that comes great freedom, knowing that He's in charge and I'm not. I can only do so much. And we did our best. We did what we could do in our sphere of influence. Fast forward 5 years later, it's 2006, and he had just turned 27. We actually had a surprise birthday party. It was Al's son-in-law, John, was in school with us, and his daughter Alexis and I planned the surprise party for the guys because their birthdays are only 7 days apart. So we went out, had a huge party. Nick was super extroverted, always wanted to get together. I'm much more introverted despite being up here. People will argue that, but I am. So it was a normal night. We woke up the next day, we went to Mass, and he had a seizure driving on the way to Mass. Of course, we didn't know what it was at the time, but he looked over at me and his face was drooping and the drool was coming, and I instantly was thinking, is this a stroke? So he pulled off into the middle lane, made me get out of the car. He thought that there was some kind of electrical impulse going through the car. How do you explain a seizure if you've never had one? I called my mom, who has worked in with residential facilities, helping mostly veterans and those with mental illness, has a lot of life experience. She said, yeah, you need to get to the hospital. So we got back in the car. He refused to let me drive because, again, he thought that it was an issue with the car. And he said, you think we can still make it to Mass? And I said, yeah, no. I think God's going to understand we're turning around and going to the hospital. So we drove to St. Joe's, and within about 45 minutes, they had run all the tests, and they came back with words that you never expect or want to hear. You have a brain tumor. And that moment is as clear to me now as it was all those years ago. We had no family here. It was us. We had made friends, had a community, school, church. The doctor was ready to leave the room. He was half out the door. And everyone knew we were on our way to Mass because 1 million people come in, you tell your story over and over again. They all knew. And he turned back and he said, can I pray with you? We said yes. So he stopped right there and prayed with us. There was a darling little nurse. She was short. Her name was Marguerite, and I'll never forget her. I just couldn't hold it together. Cried on her shoulder, literally cried on her shoulder. And she just hugged me and heard me. Didn't tell me it was going to be okay, just was there with me, and that's what I needed. And I remember that I would hold it together in the hospital, and I'd make it to the parking lot, and then I would bawl. And I'd go through my flip phone, call people until someone answered. And then I'd be a blubbering mess and they couldn't understand what I was saying. Every night we had people praying with us. Groups of friends would come in and pray with us. It was a Sunday, and by Tuesday night, I will never forget, probably one of the most tangible, intense experiences I had had ever. They were praying with us, and I had this sense of peace that just flowed through me. And I knew in that moment that no matter what, we would be okay. I didn't know what the answers were. So many questions, kept having seizures. But I knew that God was in control and that we would be okay. That went on for a while. He had a biopsy. The sample flew throughout the country for a few months. Major medical centers, Duke, Johns Hopkins, trying to identify exactly what kind of tumor it was, because then that dictates our course of action. And I will say that we've gone through enough that when I meet people who are facing adversity, the worst time is the waiting, when you don't have a plan. When you have a plan and you can direct your energy towards it, it makes all the difference in the world. You have hope, but the waiting is dark and it's heavy. That's the worst time. But I had this sense that we were okay. Worst case scenario, if I had to say goodbye to him, I knew that God was in control. Well, his parents came from Illinois, and they came to the hospital. It was time to pick him up. They had done the biopsy. And I was in the bathroom that morning, and I had this prompting from the Holy Spirit. It said, take a test, pregnancy test. And I'm thinking, this is the first time in 5 years that I had no idea where I was in my cycle. Furthest thing from my mind. Didn't even know if we had one, but it was there. So it turned into a verbal argument on my end with the Holy Spirit. I found one, and I said, fine. So I took the test. And I sat there, and 2 minutes later I looked down and I was like, you have got to be kidding me. And there she is. She just walked in. That was very well timed. God's timing is perfect, see? So, and it is. It is not anything that we would have chosen in that moment to bring a child into the world at that point in time. But it is exactly what we needed, because we would have his appointment and never know what was coming. And then we'd hear a heartbeat, or we'd get a picture. So there's great hope. But it was bittersweet, because he also wasn't able to enter in the same way that a normal husband would be able to, right? So it was her and I, on our own, fighting through that pregnancy. And I do believe that it was the grace of God. It was the easiest pregnancy I've ever heard of anyone having, right? I was never even sick. She did come late, but anyway, it was easy. After Sarah, we continued treatment. I've lost track of how many different rounds of chemo we've had, but at least 5 different rounds of chemo, 2 complete rounds of radiation. It was a long haul. But we just always knew that God was in charge. And in the hospital that day, you know, it was private. It was an individual thing that God was doing in both of our hearts. And we had this sense of mission. We knew that we had to suffer well. We knew it. We never talked about it, though, until about a year. We were out of the woods, that first part, you know. We felt like, okay, we had a routine, we had treatment, we're going, things are good, we're stable. And then we talked about it. But this was right around the time of JP2, who was our Pope. We both were at World Youth Day in Denver. He showed us how to live, but he showed us how to die. And it was also around the time of the Terry Schiavo case really becoming inflamed. And we knew that the world was lacking any example of redemptive suffering. And I actually said to him once, I said, Nick, you know, God's going to call the faithful people to suffer more. Never expected that he'd call us, but he did. We went on to foster, knowing that, you know, getting pregnant was not an easy thing. We had taken care of the root causes, but we were never able to try after Sarah because of the medication that he was on. We thought that that would be imprudent. He was adopted, and I grew up always wanted to adopt. So we knew we would. It wasn't a question of if, just a matter of when. But then again, we worked for the church. So there is a very real financial issue there. So we decided to foster. And this is something I had always said never. I could never do it. I could never say goodbye to these babies. Just never, ever, ever. My heart was closed off to it. And he was the same way. And then gradually, we were softened individually again. And we had an alumni reunion of Southeastern Michigan grads. And there was a couple there who we had been in school with. Their kids are here. And they had fostered and adopted successfully. And it was really in talking to them that all of a sudden this fire was lit in my heart. And I remember in the kitchen one day, I looked at him and I said, "We're supposed to do this, aren't we?" And he said, "Yeah, we are." And I will tell you, fostering was 10 times harder than what I thought it was going to be when I said I would never do it. We did it for 5 years. We kept our home study active in hopes that somehow we would be able to adopt. We welcomed 10 children into our home. Never once were we able to keep them for various reasons. In that time, we did adopt David. And then we still did not feel like our family was finished, but we didn't know how on earth any children were going to come to us after this. And then through divine providence and some networking, I was approached by the parent, a friend of mine, of a former student, who approached me, had a friend who was considering abortion, and said, "Well, have you considered the Thomms? You need to talk about adoption." And so both of our boys were adopted through networking. And so there comes Andrew. Andrew was born in 2017 at the height of, well, the very start of the decline, I would say. It was a steady decline from 2017 until the end in 2020. So he's never known normal. He was born into this. Sarah has never known normal. They were born under the umbrella of suffering. So, personally, suffering is essential for growth in the spiritual life. On a natural level, we know this. Your kids have growing pains, right? You watch an athlete training, you're bound to have broken bones, torn ligaments, surgeries. Those things are natural. But it's through the suffering that we grow, and your faith is put to the test. It's really an invitation to unite your suffering to that of Jesus on the cross. And there are lessons that really cannot be learned without it. The power of prayer is one of them. We prayed for Al when he lost his leg. Nick jumped on, 6 months. He was on the air filling in for Al, trial by fire. And we prayed fervently. But until we were on the receiving end of it, I had no idea the power of prayer. I tangibly would feel being lifted out of bed on some days. So it's real. And Jesus is closest in our suffering. I used to buy into the idea that God only gives you what you can handle. Everyone's heard it. We've said it. I've said it, right? But I've come to the realization that it's completely opposite of that. God always gives us more than we can handle, so that we must rely on Him, because alone we cannot do it. Freedom comes through the cross. I stole that from Tolton last night if you were here, but it's true. Just succinctly says everything that I want to say. Anyone who knew Nick would tell you that it wasn't his nature to be serene and content. He was an extrovert, a doer, always up for an adventure, always planning a party, very social. He was confident, he was a leader, he always had a plan. I watched the tumor slowly strip away so much of what he was. First, his speech, a radio guy who loved it, who thrived on bantering back and forth, whether it was a theological or moral issue, or the news of the day, or a bad sports score. He had an opinion on everything, and he was going to tell you what it was. Couldn't do his job. As a dad, unable to have a conversation or read a story to his kids, a trusted friend unable to give advice, husband and a son unable to express how he feels to the people he loves the most. And yet he willingly surrendered. And it was really remarkable to watch. Then came the mobility. Now from the very beginning, he was left-handed. Again, providence of God. And so the tumor affected his right side. but he lost all feeling in his right hand. He used to play the piano. He couldn't feel the separation of the keys. Couldn't feel how hot a pot was. And then slowly, 2017 on, the walking, we quickly went from a walker to a wheelchair. Fiercely independent guy, now dependent on all of us for his needs. More surrender. And then the cognition. Watching my extremely smart husband sit at a table not knowing how to pour milk into a bowl of cereal and use the spoon. More surrender, more trust, and not just for him, but for all of us. And with each loss along the way, he became more free and more peaceful. He used to be addicted to the 24-hour news cycle, and he would come home after doing it all day long, and this is the temptation. Al would speak to this. This is a real thing, right? You're so involved in your work, and when it's a mission, it's really your whole life. And he would watch it, and I'd get so sick of it, right? I watched from that to he'd find an article on his phone, couldn't read it, but he'd hand it to me, and I knew, because we had been together for so long, that I could communicate with his eyes. He wanted me to read it and summarize it, and tell him, really, if he needed to be mad or not. That's what was going on. So I did, and then it went to just playing games, and then slowly the phone was never picked up. It wasn't his nature to be that way, but that purification came through the suffering. He wasn't born a saint. He wasn't perfect. But I believe he became one through the suffering. And I had a front row seat to watch this happen. All it requires is really our fiat. And I chose that word with intention because no one knows suffering better than Mary. I remember going to confession once. I don't even know if you can call it confession. I was on retreat and I was a blubbering mess. And the priest said, "Your life now is the Pietà." I said, "Yep, it is." And brought back those memories of Sally's favorite artist who did the Pietà, traipsing all through Rome with them, trying to find the exact one, the perfect one, because the hand was in the right placement and everything was perfect, that we had brought back from our travels. And so I put that prominently as a reminder. This is my life right now. There is no preparation, right, to transition from spouse to caregiver. It was almost overnight. So I learned that you could grieve someone who was sitting right beside you. And every loss along the way was another cycle of grief. But I think we need to reframe our thoughts about suffering, because everyone is going to suffer eventually. It's a result of the fall. And there's never been a saint that said, "Oh, it was so easy to become holy. It's so easy to get to heaven. If you can find one, show me." Read the scripture. It's unavoidable. It's actually a privilege, though, to suffer with him. But with suffering comes vulnerability. Early on after our diagnosis, one of our best friends called us out, and he asked, "Who do you think you are to deny the body of Christ an opportunity to serve?" And those words pierced our heart. He was right. We were so used to doing it on our own. We were both type A personalities. And guess what? We had no control. So we made a conscious decision to be vulnerable. What that meant was accepting help, asking for help, being open and sharing our story, even if it was painful, and asking for prayers because simply we relied on them. We knew God had lessons to teach us, and then by default, our immediate family and our friends. But we also knew that he could do so much more if we just said yes. So back in that hospital room on that day, on that Sunday, it was a very easy choice. We had two options. We could be angry, but to what end? or we could surrender and say yes. The choice was easy. It's not easy being a trailblazer, though. When you are the first in your circle to experience anything like this, it's hard. You often don't have the people to rely on because you're the first. Happened with infertility, happened with a tumor, happened with the loss of my spouse. God puts people in your life at the right time. There are so many things that I could say. One example is during radiation, you're there every day at the same time for 6 weeks. There was another couple there, an older couple, and he was receiving treatment. And we shared, they knew we were waiting to adopt. And eventually, they finished. We kept track with each other during, Christmas cards, basically. 1 year it didn't come, and I always wondered what happened to them. Nick was out of town once, and I had Sarah, and they made a rookie mistake of getting her all dressed and then having breakfast, and so she was all cute and spilled stuff all over her. Had to change her. I knew that we were going to be late, and I was frustrated. And we got to church, and there was no parking. We walked into church, someone took our seats. And I was annoyed the whole Mass. And I thought to myself, all right, I really got to focus, I got to pull it together. Right before communion, I happened to look over, and who's sitting in the pew except the couple from radiation? Now I knew that they lived over an hour away, and they were not Catholic. And I thought, wow, okay, Lord help me remember their name. So after communion, I made a beeline, and we chatted for a little bit. Turns out, they came to the early Mass, but got the time wrong. They could have left, given up. They just went for coffee and came back for the second Mass. Had we sat in our normal seat, I never would have seen them. Never would have had that connection. Years later, I got home and I checked the mail, and it was a card from them. I was a bit relieved, but also a bit worried of what I might find inside. They had moved out of state to be close to adult children and grandchildren, and that Easter they had come into the church. Now, I don't know how much of a role we played in that. I'd like to think we played some part. But if God would have asked us to endure what we had to endure just for those two souls, we would have done it again. Nick was the first of 3 in his high school class to be diagnosed with a brain tumor. To walk with them through that, we lost one, the other one is doing well, was a blessing. So it kind of became our thing, right? It's like when you get a new car and that's the only thing that you see on the road, right? I don't know if it's that or if just people knew and they came to us. But we got so many prayer intentions for those suffering with tumors. And I was like, we got this. I know how to pray for these people. I know how to pray for that spouse. I know what that's like. Nick often said it was harder on me than it was on him. I think there was a lot of truth in that. When you have the suffering, the physical suffering, that's where your energy goes, right? Meanwhile, I'm holding it together for him and for everyone else. So resilience. This idea that you bounce back. In the spiritual life, it's not really that. Because adversity is transformative. It should be transformative. It changes you. You don't return to what you were. You're different now. How different you are, or in what ways you're different, depends on the yes that you give. Have you given your yes? It's growing through and growing around. Suffering is not imposed on us. Rather, it's a result of the fall. And yet God extends an invitation to the cross through which he shows us what love is. I wish we could see it. He offers us freedom and the gift of heaven. We made a conscious decision to live in joy because we have a God who loves us so much that came to die for us. It's in the hope of heaven that we find our joy, not in our circumstances. The journey was not easy, but the decision to say yes was. You know, in a lot of ways, I like to think that the brain tumor was kind of a tailor-made cross for us. We both have type A personalities. We like to be in control. There's always a plan, right? And yet, here we are. There is absolutely nothing we could have done to prevent it. There's nothing we missed. We had no control from the very beginning. I actually think that made it a little easier for us to say yes, because we saw that it was so outside of ourselves. There were so many times that I could only say, Jesus, I trust in you. I couldn't utter other prayers. Jesus, I trust in you. And it felt a little bit like fake it till you make it. Because I knew it, and I knew it, but I didn't feel it. But I kept saying it hundreds of times a day. And eventually, that peace came, and it never left. And that is still our family motto. But it took action and repetition. So why was it easy for us to surrender? Or how do you build resilience? Well, I think this is for all of us as we face adversity, and also looking at raising children. I'm a teacher too. I'm in the classroom, and with my own kids, I try to do this as well. Number one, my parents, who are here. They moved after Nick passed, and they have me wondering how I ever did this 20-some years without them. They serve as a shuttle and my extra hands, and it's a joy to do life with them on the daily. But they were really key in restructuring that framework, because I had some injustices in high school, big ones. And they intervened on my behalf, and I didn't know. But it was how they helped me get through it. That I was always aware that there was a spiritual reality. There was another realm in operation. It wasn't just what was here. And that there was always a reason, even if we couldn't see it, even if we didn't know what it was. And I was blessed to be with a spouse who had the same upbringing. So certainly that made it easier. I'm a product of Catholic education all the way through. And looking back, I can honestly say I had some amazing teachers. Solid formation. My 4th grade teacher taught us that every time you hear a siren, you see a siren, you stop and you say the Hail Mary, no matter what you're doing. And I don't know if my kids ever got embarrassed. I didn't care if I still do it today. I don't care if their friends are in the car. We stop everything. The radio goes off and we're praying. So parents, teachers, community. We were blessed to be here. It's like the 5th largest population of Franciscan grads in the country. Plus we have our parishes. I mean, you're hard pressed to find a bad parish these days over here. We have the school family. I've worked with the sisters for 20 years. We have connections, right? And our households too. For those of you who don't know what a household is, I know we have households here at FGR, but it's basically at Franciscan the equivalent of a sorority or a fraternity, only with the Catholic aspect. You pray together, you live together, you call each other on. And like I said, those relationships were intentional. And I'll tell you, when we knew that we were close to the end, those household sisters, some of my closest household sisters, stepped up and they said, you know what? Let's plan a party. And I said, yep, let's do it. And so hundreds of people from all over the country came. and we praised, and we worshiped, and we enjoyed food, and they said goodbye. We made the conscious decision to live out every day. And I think it actually started with David. Because breaking the news to the kids was the second hardest thing I had to do. And I remember David was playing at a friend's house. They had a bounce house in the neighborhood, so I had to pull him back from there. Sarah was sick on the couch, and it was just like a complete disaster. But I knew that we had to tell them. We had gotten the results of the MRI. We knew that there was nothing else to be done. There was one medication, I should say, but not proven to address what he was dealing with, and it would have meant he was laid out for the last 3 months. And I left it up to him. I said, I support you 100% no matter what you do. You have fought the good fight. If you choose to keep fighting, I'm there. But if you don't want to fight, I get it. No one's going to think less of you. I said, but you got to make the decision soon because I can't hold it together much longer. I would drive and had sunglasses on and just tears, hoping that the kids didn't see me. And I asked them, it was also COVID, so there were blessings that came out of that. And I said, what do you want to do? I asked Nick and I asked the kids, I said, is there something you've always wanted to do together? Somewhere you want to go? What do you want to do? And David pipes up, I've always wanted to go to London with Dad and eat a bundt cake. Okay, not sure that that's a British thing, but all right. If we would have been able to fly, I would have bought tickets to London that day. But we weren't. And then the Holy Spirit came to me one day on the way to work, and I was like, we can't go to London, but I can bring London here. I know just the right people. So I reached out to some friends who were British, and I said, hey, what do you think about surprising the kids? Can you bring London to us? I'm talking the whole 9 yards. Decorations, tea cakes, a bundt cake apparently, it has to be chocolate. Can you do that? They said, yeah. So they set up on the deck while we were gone. We came home, we opened the deck, and David was in his glory. And that started a spiral. From there, we did probably over a dozen countries. Themed dinners, people would bring us. They'd set up decorations, they'd teach us about a new place. We'd make memories. Couldn't go there physically, but they brought it to us. That's the power of community. Also an act of the will, right? You have to say yes, even if you don't feel like it. You have to make that step, right? God gives us the free will. He loves us, but he's not going to force us to love him. He's not going to force us to say yes. We have to make that decision. Here's a big one. Know the story and share it. I love teaching salvation history. I love teaching it to the little ones. It is the greatest love story ever told, and it's our story. It's your story. Know it and share it. Do the same in your personal story. Identify those moments in your life where God has been faithful and draw on them continuously. When you have the eyes to see, you can't not see. Way back, freshman year, we hadn't started dating yet. I was feeling like a little nervous, went alone, not knowing anyone. In high school, I felt like I was kind of put into the box. I was the girl you marry, I wasn't the girl you date, never had a boyfriend, never, it was just, my experience was very different. And so I thought, you know what? I get to be who I want to be. And I'm going to go to Mass every day. How can you not? Just 5 Masses a day. So I did. And I signed up for a holy hour on Friday night at 9 o'clock because in high school I had no life. And I didn't realize that absolutely everything happened on Friday night at 9 o'clock. Note to self. but I never missed it. I would go to a dance and leave the dance and do my hour and come back. I never missed it. And it was in that time of focusing on the Lord and putting him first that all of a sudden, everything that I had ever wanted was in front of me. And so I knew that he was going to ask me to the dance, and so he did. And I started to get wind of like, oh, he likes you. And I'm thinking, what? No, we're just friends. And the next day, we were out so late that the next day was Saturday, and I wanted to go to Mass, but I missed Mass on campus. And his sister was there and had a car, and he said, well, I'll drive you. We'll go off campus. I said, okay. He's like, it's anticipatory. I said, I don't care. I said, I'm going to Mass every day, and I'm going to Mass every day. I don't care if it counts for tomorrow. I'll go again tomorrow. And so we went. And at the time, everyone was, holding hands during the Our Father, and, we shouldn't be doing that, but we did. And I remember this sense, it wasn't a voice necessarily, it was a sense, that no matter what, together we could get through anything. And I thought, oh, isn't that sweet? I must really like him. Maybe there is something there. Yeah, you fast forward to the diagnosis, slow growing brain tumor, been there for about 10 years. Do the math, freshman year. Those breadcrumbs are all throughout our story, but do you have the eyes to see them? Find them. Share them. Because that's what gets you through, right? We know that God is faithful. In his nature, he's faithful. He can't be anything but faithful. And when I teach the little ones, I love to use the example of the whiny Israelites. God does this miraculous thing, takes them across the Red Sea, destroys the enemies. Yay, God! They go through the desert. Oh, it would be better if we were back in Egypt. I'm so thirsty. I'm so hungry. They call out. He answers. He provides for their need. Yay, God! And over and over and over and over again. And isn't that us? That's us. We're the whiny Israelites in the desert. But that faithfulness continues through our story. There are so many examples I can give. So many. We could be here all day, but I know I don't have that time. When I'm teaching salvation history, or really anything, I want my kids to walk out of that classroom knowing 3 things. 1, God has always had a plan. 2, you have always been part of that plan. And 3, God is always faithful. Even when you don't understand it, even when you can't see a way out. We have tunnel vision of the plan. And it's probably a good thing, honestly, because if we saw everything all at once, we wouldn't be able to handle it. But when you're in it, the grace is there for the moment, even if you don't feel like it. Because when you're outside of that adversity, and the grace is gone, you look back and you say, did I really do that? That's how I feel some days. Did we really live that? The grace is there and it is sufficient. But what happens when the miracle doesn't come? Well, we prayed. We wanted one. But we knew that he was going to be healed either way. Either here, and if that was the case, we imagined the great ripple effect that that would have, and all the people that would come back to God through his example of suffering, and suffering well. But we also knew that if God chose to call him home, it was because his plan involved something greater than we could imagine, that could only be accomplished with him not being here. Which again, hard to imagine here. But we knew if that was God's plan and he asked us to walk to the end, to finish the race, we would do it willingly and with joy, because that was his plan. One last thing I'll say in terms of parenting. When I realized that those kids were never mine, any kids that we would ever have were not mine, there was freedom in that. And after his loss, I realized right away I could not heal them. That's not my work. That's God's work within them. All I could do was provide the opportunity, the environment for God to meet them where they were, which meant knowing who their friends were, making sure they were around the right people to build them up, putting them in situations where they could encounter Christ. David last year, I sent him to 4 camps, not because I was sick of him or I didn't want to be around him, but I lovingly called it the summer of man up. And it worked. He came back changed because he encountered difficulties along the way with like-minded people who were his age and terrific counselors who helped him along the way. And the same for Sarah. So remember that your kids are not yours, right? God's in control. You can make all the mistakes in the world and they'll still turn out beautifully. Or you could do everything that you think is right and they're going to stray. That work is for God. You plant the seeds and you plant them deep. And you do your part, but the rest is in God's hands. So I will leave you with, if you are facing adversity, or when you do, because everyone will, take that first step. Jesus, I trust in you. He's going to take care of the rest, but you have to make that act of faith, make that act of will. Thank you.